Welcome to this deep dive. You're always so curious about Vikings.
Always.
We're going way further than those horned helmets, though.
Okay.
We're going back, way back to the 10th century
Okay.
with this guy, Ibn Fadlan.
All right.
He's this Arab traveler who got up close and personal with Vikings on the Volga River, of all places. His firsthand account is like finding a time capsule, really gives us a look at Viking culture from the outside in.
What makes Ibn Fadlan's writing so compelling is that he's offering us a perspective we just don't see that often in the historical record. You see, so much of what we think we know about Vikings comes from the people they were interacting with, and a lot of times those people were their enemies.
Right, of course.
But Ibn Fadlan, he's different. He's seeing this culture on its own terms, and that's huge.
It's like we stumbled on a blog from 1,000 years ago. It's exactly. He wrote about everything. What they look like, what they did every day, even, their hygiene, which, let's be real,
Yeah.
probably wasn't great.
Probably not by our standards.
Yeah.
But that's what makes it so valuable. He doesn't hold back, but he's also surprisingly objective, especially considering he's coming from the Abbasid Caliphate. This wasn't just a cultural difference. It was a totally different sensory experience for him.
Yeah, okay. So set the scene for us. We've got Ibn Fadlan. He's going from Baghdad to the Volga Bulgars. It's 921 AD. What takes him on this journey, and what kind of world is he stepping into?
Well, he was on a diplomatic mission sent by the Caliph himself.
Oh, wow. Big deal.
Right. The Volga Bulgars, they'd recently converted to Islam. And the Caliph, he wants to strengthen those ties. So, picture this. You're going from Baghdad, the intellectual hub of the world at that time, to, well, the frontier.
Yeah, talk about a culture shock.
Absolutely. It would be like stepping onto another planet almost.
What were some of the biggest things that really struck him?
He was surprised by the simplest things, like their cooking, for example. Ibn Fadlan, he mentions several times how much they love fish oil. And you can practically smell it in his writing how much he wasn't a fan. But you got to remember, this guy's used to the incredible food in Baghdad, all those flavors and aromas. This would have been a shock to his system, to say the least.
It's these everyday things that really make history come to life, And speaking of sensory overload, Ibn Fadlan's description of a Viking ship burial, man, it's both captivating and, to be honest, kind of intense.
It's an unforgettable scene. He doesn't sugarcoat anything, describes the whole ritual, even the part where a slave girl, he calls her the angel of death, chooses to die with her master.
Yeah, he talks about her going from tent to tent, doing what he calls acts of folly with the men as like a farewell. It's just, wow. It's not something you usually hear about with Vikings. It's somber, celebratory, and honestly, a lot to process.
Yeah, no kidding. It's a difficult scene, even now. But it shows us something really important about their worldview. You see, the angel of death, she wasn't seen as a victim. They saw her as a guide, someone helping the deceased make their way in the afterlife. They believed everything, and I mean everything, possessions. Even people had this spirit that went with the departed.
It's wild how different their way of looking at death was from his. He doesn't say he agrees with it or anything, but he writes it all down.
That's what I like about Ibn Fadlan. He wasn't just watching from the sidelines. He knew he was witnessing something much bigger. Think about it. He was traveling at a time of massive change in Eurasia. The Vikings were moving east. The Islamic world was booming under the Abbasids. Two worlds about to collide. And what connected them? Trade. All these networks that were starting to flourish.
And whenever you have trade, there are going to be some stories. He says these fascinating things like how swords were super valuable, almost like their form of money, like they were trading them for furs and things. He even writes about Vikings tossing swords into this sea of darkness. They thought it would make them catch more fish.
I know, right? It's easy to write these practices off as just superstition. But if you really think about it, they show us this mindset where the spiritual and practical were totally intertwined. It wasn't just about making the gods happy, it was about survival. The sea was their livelihood.
Makes you wonder what Ibn Fadlan would have thought of our modern-day rituals. Maybe throwing a coin in a fountain isn't so different after all. But hey, let's talk about another interesting story, his run-in with the remains of a giant.
Right, the giant of Gog and Magog. So Ibn Fadlan, he tells us about this time when the Bulgar king took him out to this dark forest.
Oh, okay.
And there, among the trees, supposedly, was this massive, massive skeleton.
Wow.
This giant. Couldn't speak, and everyone who saw him totally terrified.
And they say seeing is believing, right? But Ibn Fadlan's careful to mention that he's just telling us what he heard. Still, you can kind of feel how much the story got to him. What do you think? Was there actually a giant roaming around back then?
Well, it's probably more a case of, folklore, stories getting exaggerated over time.
Right.
But it shows us how people thought about the world beyond what they knew. For Ibn Fadlan, traveling to these places, it would have been like stepping into, like, a fantasy epic. This sense of wonder, but also this underlying fear, unknown.
A world full of giants and who knows what else. That's some Game of Thrones stuff right there.
Exactly. That same feeling of the unknown, the unexplored. And speaking of which, Ibn Fadlan's travels weren't just about Vikings and mythical creatures. He ran into a ton of different cultures. And one that's really interesting, especially since you mentioned wanting to hear more about them, the Khazars.
Oh, yeah. The Khazars, a Jewish kingdom in the middle of Eurasia. That just blows my mind. What's their deal?
So the Khazars, they were a big deal back then, controlled a huge chunk of land, what we now call southern Russia, Ukraine.
Okay.
And you're right, their leaders, they'd converted to Judaism centuries before Ibn Fadlan. Really makes you rethink how we see those religious and political lines back then.
So they weren't just some kingdom off on their own then. How'd they get along with their neighbors?
They were major players. Ibn Fadlan actually met their king, the guy who controlled these vital trade routes, connecting the Islamic world, the Byzantine Empire, and, those Viking territories we keep talking about. The Khazars weren't just getting by, they were thriving. Right there at the center of everything.
Talk about location, location, location. It sounds like their political system, it was pretty advanced too.
Ibn Fadlan gives us some clues about that too. He describes this, hierarchy. The king at the top, obviously. But there's this other figure, the Khagan. Seemed to have more of a symbolic role, almost spiritual.
So like a ruler in name only. Why even have a Khagan at all?
It seems like he gave them a sense of, stability. A link to their past, even while someone else was really running things, shows you that power can be more than just, brute force.
It's crazy how Ibn Fadlan's trips show us these weird connections, These things we might not see if we're just focused on one piece of history. It wasn't just Vikings battling everyone. There's this whole web of interactions happening across Eurasia.
Exactly. It reminds us that history is never simple. It's full of, surprises, unexpected team-ups, cultures changing and mixing in ways you'd never guess. And, those Vikings we keep coming back to.
It's easy to think of Vikings as just, warriors and raiders.
Yeah.
But Ibn Fadlan, he gives us a bit more, don't you think?
He really does. He saw that warrior side, no doubt, but he also saw their sense of community, how welcoming they could be, even to outsiders. There's this part where he talks about seeing a group of Vikings all gathered around a fire, just sharing stories and songs. It makes them relatable. Like, these were real people, with their own hopes and fears and traditions.
A Viking campfire sing-along. Who knew? But it reminds us there's always more to the story than the stereotypes. So what about their legacy? I mean, Ibn Fadlan saw these Viking communities thriving. But does he give us any hints about, what happens next?
That's where it gets even more interesting. Remember, these guys weren't just fighters. They were explorers, traders, settlers. These same Vikings Ibn Fadlan met, they went on to establish settlements all over Iceland, Greenland, even North America. Their story is all about adapting and, pushing those boundaries.
Ibn Fadlan's whole trip to the edge of the known world, it wasn't just about going far away, was it? He was pushing his own limits, coming face to face with cultures that were so different from his.
Exactly. And in a way, that's what his story does for us, too. It's like he's encouraging us to look at history not just as a bunch of facts, but as like a tapestry of experiences.
Okay, I like that.
Messy, contradictory, all of it. He's reminding us to question what we think we know and to, be open to different perspectives.
It's like that saying, the world is a book, and those who don't travel only read one page. Ibn Fadlan, he read a lot of pages. And he wants us to do the same, to keep an open mind and stay curious.
Could have said it better myself. So as we wrap up our deep dive into Ibn Fadlan's world, here's what I think we should take away. Embrace the fact that history is complicated. Look for those unexpected details, those things that challenge how you see the past.
It's about finding those connections that link us together, right? All across time, across cultures, even as we're appreciating all the things that make each moment in history unique.
Exactly.
Oh.
And who knows, maybe by understanding the past a little better, we can figure out this crazy world we live in today.
At the end of this podcast, please share your thoughts on the book, and if you enjoy this content, don't forget to like and subscribe for more.